Today, the subject that interests us is the real beneficiaries of companies. This is an important issue and is now a provision that has been made through decrees to work better within the framework of transparency in the extractive sector. We are working today with CIPE and we have decided to conduct an awareness campaign on the real beneficiaries of companies because indeed through the Department of Justice, we have seen that the registry exists. There are also regulatory legislative measures that have been taken. There are more than 146 companies that have already registered. However, we hope that in this context, more companies will be registered to better understand and apprehend those who are in the extractive sector, and today also invite the state and civil society to play a more important role in the dissemination of information to the actual beneficiaries of the enterprises. This is important because we already know that in the sector there is the phenomenon of illicit financial flows, tax avoidance and evasion, which causes resource-rich countries to lose a lot of money, but which does not have sufficient institutional means and recourse to prevent tax evasion and avoidance. So this law can help to better identify the people who are behind the shell companies or the montages that are made. It's almost impossible in the present context, for example, to identify problems of conflict of interest and crime to initiate. So we think that's a good instrument for more transparency and to facilitate the mobilization of domestic resources for countries rich in natural resources. However, it must be said, the law is one thing, but its implementation is another. As it's configured in Senegal, it's difficult to make the objective that's truly effective because already, so that actors such as civil society can access data on the beneficial owners. The administrative procedure is a bit restrictive, so it does not promote work. It should be much more fluid, obviously, in the respect of personal data because it's another legal instrument we have adopted, but which should not prevent it from having delays or blockages to allow different types of actors who are in the sector to be able to really access this data. So this information should have been public park. So we do not see why we should continue to put safeguards to clearly know who is behind what company, who is developing resources, for example. So I think that's the only blockage there is, and we should be working on more to have much more direct mechanisms, much more fluid in terms of access to beneficial ownership data. And we also have the legislative framework for local content that needs to be enforced. We must therefore ensure that those involved in this sector are known and recognized to avoid all forms of corruption, all forms of clerkship, and all forms of compulsion that can harm the economy of our country. We thus engage with local actors, whether it's the ITE, whether it's the Ministry of Justice, or with our partner CIPE and all civil society organizations, the Civil Forum Ex-Africa, the NGO 3D, and others to ensure that this provision is well known by economic actors, is also well controlled by parliamentarians, but also its regular monitoring to ensure that companies in the private sector want legal transparency and also gives the right information for traceability of their activity. Today we are at a stage where the law has been passed for more than a year, but what we found is this law is not known at all. And it's important today that we actors of civil society, the state, and even the other types of actors of these contracts, because there is a provision which says that to really have this information, it's necessary to address a letter to the judge and also to justify the interest, which one has to have this information there. For that, my conviction is that today it's a law that's available, but who is a little restrictive. And I think that today it's quite happy to have an action developed by OSIDEA to sensitize the actors, but also how to build an advocacy speech to allow citizens to better understand the content of this law, but also how to allow citizens to have access without major difficulties to all this information.
Au Sénégal, ces dernières années, il y a eu beaucoup d'efforts
In Senegal, in recent years, there has been a lot of effort in reforms to strengthen transparency and accountability in the management of natural resources. One of those references we can cite the transparency of beneficial ownership is that companies must disclose the data of the actual owners of the different projects or the different multinationals that operate in the extractive sector. This said is a fundamental effort because until then, malicious individuals could hide behind certain companies to finance either terrorism or encourage corruption of one form or another, or be mixed with other forms of fraud, whether it's tax fraud or any other form. That could affect the stability of our state, also the public finance. This is why it's commendable that Senegal can make effort in terms of transparency on beneficial ownership. The assessment we have is that until then, the legal principle exists, but access to this data on the real owners remains problematic. The law does not allow any individual who needs that data to access it in a much easier way, and that was the spirit of that text. Unfortunately, the difficulties of procedures make it difficult for citizens to prove the very legitimacy of their need for access to this information. So this is already a fundamental block that should be addressed. If we take a look at the situation, we will see that Senegalese commitment to make a reality of beneficial ownership results first of all from the commitment that Senegal has made to, beyond the norm of the Anti-Corruption Convention BAFI results, more from the commitment of the standard ITE 2019, which requires all countries that implement the standard to set up a register of effective beneficiaries as of January 2020. To materialize this commitment, Senegal has first set up a legal framework, namely the Decree 2020, which was accompanied by a decree that relates to the establishment of this register of effective beneficiaries, but also in relation to the form that companies must use to make their statement. This legal framework has been popularized to justice professionals first because it's up to them to manage this registry. It has also been popularized at the level of taxable person because the register refers to all companies involved in the value chain. So it's as well the oil companies as the mining companies, but also their subcontractors. So the legal framework has been popularized at the level of these actors, and it should also be noted that today the state of Senegal has really made the commitment to make the ownership of the effective beneficiaries a priority. Because beyond this text that I just quoted, we have the reform of the 2021 finance law that now extends the declaration of effective beneficiary to the entire economic sector. It's no longer simply the extractive sector now. A company has been established in Senegal, you are obliged to declare your beneficial beneficiary. Even if the regime is a little different from the registry that the Ministry of Justice manages, because compared to the order and the taxes of the Ministry of Finance law there, you currently have the law on public and private partnership, which also focuses on the actual beneficiaries. You also have the oil code, you have the gas code. Just to tell you now, there is really an unequivocal commitment that the state has made to make the declaration of beneficiaries effective, the transparency of the economic sector in general a reality. This is why every time the state adopts a text, we try to recall this requirement, to tell you that the legal framework is there. The ministry is responsible for making this register operational, has started activities, and it was facilitated by the accession. This is why every time the state adopts a text, we try to recall this requirement, to tell you that the legal framework is there. The ministry is responsible for making this register operational, has started activities, and it was facilitated by the accession of Senegal to a program called Open Extractive Program, which helps all countries that implement the ITE standard, and Senegal was the first Francophone country. And this is thanks to the results of the last evaluation, where the Ministry of Justice received a letter from the International ITE to invite it to join this Open Extractive Program. And thanks to this program, we have put in place a roadmap where we have started activities to raise awareness of justice professionals. We have also sensitized civil society, which is the stakeholder in this fight. We have also sensitized taxpayers. To tell you that there are things that have been done, but we must have to also be realistic and say that there are still things to do. Because if we take the statement, we are at 163 statements, which is minimal. As a reminder, it's all the actors who intervene in the value chain, and I do not have the exact figure in mind, but there are more than 1,000 companies that intervene. Then 163 statements is minimal. So there are still things to do. We are talking about a threshold of 25%, whereas for the Department of Justice, in the register we are talking about a threshold of 2%. Now I think the civil society that had made a great plea for the adoption of these laws, but also the problems that are posed by certain states victims of tax evasion and avoidance of illicit financial flows, must to bring these actors there. These different types of stakeholders to create more a kind of alliance at all levels, at the national, regional and international level, to frame this law and promote its effectiveness. I think that on this level, all the stakeholders, the states and the organizations of the civil society must be able to put together in alliance to stem the impulses of resistance which can come simply from the private sector, which is alone to have interest to keep the secrecy in the field. Or some types of civil servants who are in collusion with the private sector and who can promote certain criminal practices such as conflict of interest but also corruption. Issues are diverse. There are primary peace and security issues. As I said earlier, it's important we be able to ensure who is behind the companies that operate in our territory, in the context of the financing of terrorism in the world and any other form of fraud. Then Africa suffers a lot of what we call tax fraud through illicit financial flows, and generally it's the ignorance of the actual owners of these companies that could promote this, and all other forms of conflict of interest in the governance of the sector, and particularly in the ownership of these companies. What makes that some actors consider as being politically exposed, it can be officials of the government or it can be other actors, even from any other sector that can have interest and shares in that companies. If we cannot put our eyes on their name, their identity, it proves that we are not yet ready to address the lack of transparency in this sector. The last issue I would like to mention is related to the economic issue itself. The economic issue is what? That's to say the investments that are made in this sector and the benefits that emerge should be able to benefit the economy of Senegal. But if the actual owners are people who are hidden behind other international companies and who do not benefit our economy in any way, I think this is a fundamental issue that should be analyzed. Beyond the fight against corruption, you will see that beneficial ownership has benefits for all stakeholders. Already for the state, it's in relation to its struggles against corruption and money laundering, but also to know who is behind. Because beneficial ownership may be that we have not had the opportunity to go back on the definition, but it's the person or persons who ultimately control the businesses. It's to really know who is behind these activities. So for the state, in the first place, it's a question of security, we can even say of national sovereignty. It's also a question of cleaning up the extractive sector, which is sometimes very sensitive. Beyond that, it's to mobilize resources, but also to fight tax evasion, to name a few. For companies, it's interesting for them because declaring the effective beneficiaries make it possible to clean up and have a fair competition between them, because we will know who is who to intervene in this sector. But also for citizens and civil society, we can say that its response to our Constitution, Article 25, Indent 1, which says that natural resources belong to the people. So from there, we see that there is a duty of accountability that arises. In relation to this duty of accountability, the state to the obligation to inform. By this mechanism of setting up the register of the effective beneficiaries, it can be said that has benefit as much for the state, for the civil society, for citizens. It can be said that everyone gains in this transparency of the effective beneficiaries, which has become an obligation. Finally, in terms of the role or actions that players could take, I think it's urgent that we work to make this law much more flexible in terms of access to this information, even if the use of the information should be regulated. Secondly, Senegal has not yet adopted a law on access to information, even though such a law is essential if we are to implement access to the identities of companies' real owners. So I think it's a logic, it's a direct link, which means that both the state and civil society players and those who are even involved in mining, oil and gas operations should today encourage the publication of this access to information law or the adoption of this law. The last thing that the players could do is to ensure that these data are also used in the much more scientific way to avoid exposing the people behind them, including the politically exposed, because the use of data can sometimes have quite unfortunate consequences of the people concerned. These are the few points I want to share with you on the issue of beneficial ownership in Senegal. As regards the players involved in implementing this register, it's true that there is the Ministry of Justice, but today there are other players. There is the Ministry of Mines, because we mustn't forget that it's the ministry responsible of these companies. There is the Ministry of Finance, because the Ministry of Finance also has a register of these actual beneficiaries. There is also the Ministry of Petroleum, of course, and you got the National ITE Committee and civil society. So everyone has a very specific role. As far as the Ministry of Justice is concerned, we need to focus on training clerks, because the clerks in charge of the RBE are at the forefront. We have to make them aware, but we also have to train them. So that's the ministry's primary role. As far as the Ministry of Mines and the Ministry of Petroleum are concerned, they are the supervisory ministries. So they too must help the ministry to ensure that every company that applies for a license has made its declaration. They have this monitoring role because they are the ones who directly manage these oil and mining companies. As far as the civil society is concerned, as I said earlier concerning beneficial ownership and the question of the transparency, it also has a role to play in raising awareness. So everyone has a very determined role to play, and the big difficulty is to get all these players to coordinate. Everyone can't go alone, because the question of effective beneficiaries is a cross-cutting issue, because the Ministry of Justice can't directly compel companies. It's the Ministry of Mines that has to issue circulars to oblige companies to declare, and the Ministry of Petroleum recently issued 2 circulars available on their website reminding companies of their obligation to declare. In other words, everyone has a very important role to play in this register, so we need to find coherence between these players to ensure that the issue of effective beneficiaries is a reality in our country. We will also be working very closely with the Ministry of Justice to ensure that these provisions are improved and that journalists themselves have access to this information.
Soient améliorées et que les journalistes eux-mêmes puissent avoir accès à l'information.
Frankly, OSIDEA has become a key player in the extractive sector in general, thanks to the work it does. And if my memory serves me right, they were the first to contact us at the ministry on the issue of effective beneficiaries. So it's fair to say that, for the time being, they are really on the right track. So we can say that, for the moment, they are really at the forefront of this issue of transparency. Because the issue of effective beneficiaries, as I said earlier, is one in which everyone has a role to play, and we can say that OSIDEA is really playing its part to the full, and we encourage them for that. Many thanks to them.